It is loading. And we are on Facebook.
Are we live?
We should be.
Okay. Welcome, everybody. We live? Am I good? Okay. Thanks. Welcome, everybody. In fact, welcome all 159 of you that registered for this event. In fact, there may be more of you because I know some of you are watching on Facebook and some of you are watching in teams or families. So thank you so much for joining us on what I think will be a very exciting afternoon. We do have Matt Rothschild waiting in the wings, and we're very excited to hear what he has to teach us and what he has to tell us. Many of you have told us that you're already very engaged in voter activities this season. Many of you have told us about things that you're doing, that you're working hard, and some of you have shared some good ideas of even more things that we can do for voter engagement. I want to assure you that at the end of this program, we will have action items posted on our slides, and you will be getting copies of all of the slides. So you will get very concrete information about how to get involved if you're not already involved. But first, I'd like to take this opportunity to put a little context on this. I want us all to take a moment to remember and imagine the very first time you voted, or the very first time you went to a polling place. It might be that you were a young child and you went with an adult behind that mysterious voting curtain, and you got to watch the adult you were with pull a lever and actually vote. It might be for some of us that the first time we voted, we had a chance to vote for someone who would end the Vietnam War that so many of our friends and relatives were at risk for having to fight in. Or it might be that for some of us, the first time you voted, you got to vote for somebody who might really do something about climate change. How did it feel? Do you remember? Maybe you got a sticker. Maybe there were cupcakes outside the polling place. However, maybe you saw your friends or your neighbors, or you went with family members. It's likely that most of us did not wait more than an hour to vote. And for the most part, we had a feel-good feeling. We felt good about participating in the process. The movie that we're going to see a trailer of shows some scenes of polling places that look a lot like what I recall voting. People greeting each other, nobody waiting too long, nobody getting hassled. But now I want you to imagine a different scene. Imagine that you waited for not 1 hour or 2 hours, but 5 hours in the rain to vote. Imagine that after waiting 5 hours, somebody told you that your paperwork wasn't in order and that you weren't properly registered and that you couldn't vote. Imagine that even though you did file all your paperwork, somebody told you, we think you moved, even though you really didn't move, and so this isn't your proper voting place anymore. Or imagine that you tried to register to vote and somebody accused you of not being a citizen of the United States. For some people, and maybe some of us, this is a very different experience. Not everyone experiences voting in the country or even in this state in the same way. And of course, we're here today to learn more about why that's the case, and more important, what we can do about it. And there is plenty to do. Again, there will be action items sent to you later. But what better way to get to work and to accomplish this than through a partnership between the Wisconsin Interfaith Voter Engagement Campaign, whose partners are the Wisconsin Council of Churches, who is led by the Justice Coordinator, Dr. Peter Bakken, and Wisconsin Faith Voices for Justice, whose executive director is Rabbi Bonnie Margulies. Now I'm frustrated that I can't hear your applause. But I want everybody to applaud right now. These two people, they have worked so hard, Dr. Bakken and Rabbi Margulies, and they deserve a great deal of our gratitude. These two organizations have partnered in the belief that all of our faith communities can play an influential role in the public square by working together to increase engagement in the voting process. So thank you, Rabbi Margulies. Thank you, Dr. Bakken. And I also want to thank the rest of our sponsors that are listed on the slide that I hope all of you can see. Because without these sponsors, we would not have been able to make this event possible. Now we're going to move on and we're going to show you a trailer of a very good movie. When you registered, you were sent a link to this movie, and we understand that many of you have already watched it. If you haven't watched the movie, please, we encourage you to do so. This trailer is only 2 minutes long. And by the way, if for some reason the technology gets screwed up and your screen goes blank, don't go away. Stick with us. It's only 2 minutes, and we do have Matt Rothschild standing by. So I hope that everybody can see the entire movie, but even as you watch the trailer, you will notice that there are clever, tricky tools that are used to discourage and deny voting. Now, the movie's about Georgia in 2018, but this could happen anywhere, any year, yes, even in Wisconsin. These clever, tricky tools aren't as dramatic as a cross burning or white hoods or a lynching, but in the words of the commentator of the movie, they are bureaucratic, mundane, routine, but lethal. So with that, we're going to move on to the trailer. Ready?
Record-breaking voter registration, record-breaking numbers.
Breaking
record numbers.
The numbers are simply staggering.
Oh, beautiful for spacious skies, for amber.
We have a saying around here that voting is a sacred act.
The first time you vote is like it's a milestone. Voting is something that's special in my house.
I knew the importance of the upcoming election, and I wanted to be a part of that history.
Above the fruited
I saw this ad saying that there was a proposal to close 7 of the 9 precincts in Randolph County. I said, what?
God
It was really getting close to the election date, and I never received my ballot.
And crowned like
Election day came and went, and I wasn't able to vote in the end.
I waited 2 hours in line to find out that I couldn't vote. It's upsetting to be that difficult.
My license is valid, my address is valid, I own this home. Why are you questioning my right to vote?
God shed his grace on me. Crown thy good with brotherhood from sea.
I'm 65, and for the first time, I did not get a chance to vote. Welcome to Georgia.
Okay. So now it's my pleasure to introduce a gentleman that we're all looking forward to hearing from. Matt Rothschild is currently the executive director of the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign, which exposes the problem of money in our politics, agitates against gerrymandering and voter suppression, and advocates for a democracy where everyone has an equal voice. You might hear Matt on Wisconsin Public Radio, or Mort in Madison or other radio stations around the state, and you might read his commentaries in the Cap Times or the State Journal or the Wisconsin Examiner or Urban Milwaukee. He also testifies at the state capitol, and of course, until COVID, he was traveling quite a bit across the state of Wisconsin, giving talks. Prior to coming to the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign, which was almost 6 years ago, we all remember that Matt worked at the Progressive magazine for 32 years, most of that time as editor and publisher. And on a personal note, I remember Matt as that guy who used to camp out at the Ancora coffee shop on the square and who was always willing to chat. And speaking of chatting, we're going to ask you to refrain from chatting during Matt's talk because it's very distracting to read comments while we're listening to the speaker. But when Matt is finished speaking, we will invite you to use the chat tool in order to ask questions that Matt will be happy to answer. So with that, Mr. Rothschild.
Well, thanks very much for that introduction, Cynthia, and thanks everyone for tuning into this Zoom and for all that you're doing. I also want to thank Rabbi Bonnie for inviting me here in the first place, and I want to thank the co-sponsors and all the dedicated organizers who put this important event together. That trailer gives you a taste, just a foretaste of voter suppression, especially what it was like in Georgia. I do encourage you, if you haven't seen the whole film, to watch the whole film, and I know that was put into the chat, a link for that. The film is a real eye-opener. It lays it all out there, especially for what happened in Georgia. But what happened in Georgia in 2018 is just a classic example, as Cynthia mentioned, and as a number of people in the film mentioned, of what's been going on all over the country, including here in Wisconsin. Actually, we made a couple of cameos in the film itself. They weren't good cameos, they weren't pretty cameos. But before I get to what's been going on in Wisconsin, I'd like to try to put things in historical perspective for maybe 10, 15 minutes, because voter suppression didn't start in 2018 in Georgia, not by a long shot. For the fact of the matter is, the franchise in the United States has been suppressed since 1776. At our founding, only white male property owners could vote. One of our founding fathers, Governor Morris of New York, who wrote the lofty words of the preamble to our Constitution, wasn't so high-minded when he referred to propertyless white folks. He called them reptiles. People who don't own property, he said, don't deserve to vote. The expansion of the suffrage to white working men occurred state by state, and actually Ben Franklin led the way in Pennsylvania. Here was the classic case that clever old Ben made to say why white men who didn't own property should be allowed to vote. Here's what he said. Today, a man owns a jackass worth $50 and he's entitled to vote because the jackass is his property. But before the next election, the jackass dies. The man in the meantime has become more experienced, his knowledge of the principles of government and his acquaintance with mankind have become more extensive, but the jackass is dead. Now, pray inform me, in whom does the right of suffrage reside? Does it reside in the man, asked Ben Franklin, or does it reside in the jackass? So gradually more and more states agreed that the right to vote resided in the man, not the jackass, the white man anyway. The battle to gain the vote for the black man was not an easy one, as you know. Frederick Douglass and the abolitionists championed it, but racists opposed it vehemently. Senator John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, a horrible racist, warned that it would allow former slaves to gain political and social equality with their former owners. Heaven forbid that. Yet the Civil War itself, where 1 in 10 Union soldiers were black, made a compelling argument for granting blacks the right to vote. This wasn't lost on William Tecumseh Sherman, who said, when the fight is over, the hand that drops the musket cannot be denied the ballot. The 15th Amendment passed in 1870. The battle to gain the vote for women wasn't a short or easy one either. During the fight for independence, Abigail Adams wrote her husband, John, remember the ladies. if particular care and attention isn't paid to the ladies, we're determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have not voice nor representation. As many of you know, the fomenting of this rebellion began in earnest at Seneca Falls in 1848. And for the next 72 years, activists for women's suffrage demanded the vote. One of those was Belle Case La Follette here in Wisconsin, and her friend Jane Addams. Jane Addams, writing in 1912, put it pithily when she gave a speech entitled "If Things Were Reversed," which was excerpted by Belle Case La Follette in La Follette's Weekly, which later became known as the Progressive Magazine. Jane Addams flipped the script in this little speech she gave. She asked how men would react if they were denied the right to vote and had to listen to the same belittling rationales for this denial that women were hearing over and over again. She parroted those rationales one after another. Here she went. First, men would find politics corrupting if they voted. Second, men would vote as their wives and mothers did. Third, men's suffrage would only double the vote without changing the results. Fourth, men's suffrage would diminish the respect for men. Fifth, most men don't really want to vote. And sixth, the best men won't vote. Well, we Wisconsinites can be proud because we were the first state to ratify the 19th Amendment, as you've probably heard. That was back in June 1919, 101 years ago. 14 months later, 100 years ago, last month, it became part of the US Constitution. But even as the suffrage was expanding, a powerful and ugly backlash was underway. In the Jim Crow South, as I'm sure you know, whites used steep poll taxes and ridiculously obscured so-called literacy tests to deny Black citizens the right to vote. One infamous question that some Black people had to answer was, how many bubbles are there on a bar of soap? That's not a literacy test. That's state-sponsored voter suppression. And they used intimidation and violence, including lynchings, as Cynthia pointed out, to deter Black people from voting. And then they rewrote their state constitutions to criminalize a whole variety of actions and then stripped convicts of the right to vote. This was all very intentional. Take Alabama. The president of the state's 1901 Constitutional Convention, John Knox, said the goal of the convention was to, and now I'm quoting, establish white supremacy in this state. We must establish it by law, not by force or fraud. And here's how they did it. The 1901 Constitution specified all the different acts that could cost you the vote. The following person shall be disqualified both from registering and from voting, namely, all idiots and insane persons, those who shall, by reason of conviction of crime, be disqualified from voting at the time of the ratification of this Constitution, those who shall be convicted of treason, murder, arson, embezzlement, malfeasance in office, larceny, receiving stolen property, obtaining property or money under false pretenses, perjury, subordination of perjury, robbery, assault with intent to rob, burglary, forgery, bribery, assault and battery of the wife, bigamy, living in adultery, sodomy, incest, rape, miscegenation, crime against nature, or any crime punishable by imprisonment in the penitentiary, or of any infamous crime or crime involving moral turpitude. And of course, moral turpitude was never defined, by the way. And this law was applied almost exclusively on Black people to strip them of the right to vote. Take Virginia. State Representative Carter Glass introduced a felon disenfranchisement bill at the turn of the century that he said would eliminate the darky as a political factor in less than 5 years. He said his goal was to discriminate to the very extremity with a view to the elimination of every Negro voter who can be gotten rid of. So we really have to recognize the blatantly racist roots of voter suppression in America. Now, the Civil Rights Movement and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 did away with the poll tax and that so-called literacy test and some of the other obstacles to voting, but another backlash ensued. After the gains of the Civil Rights Movement, the white supremacists and the reactionaries in this country weren't happy. And like their predecessors in Jim Crow South, they were blunt about it. I give you Paul Weyrich, W-E-Y-R-I-C-H, one of the leaders of the social conservative movement, told a gathering of the religious right back in 1980. Here's what he said. I don't want everybody to vote. our leverage in the elections, quite candidly, goes up as the voting population goes down. You can see him saying that for yourself if you just want to Google Paul Weyrich and leverage and elections on YouTube, and you'll see the 41-second clip. It's pretty outrageous. In the South, though, they didn't really get a chance to do all that much of voter suppression until the US Supreme Court in the Shelby County case of 2013 did away with part of the Voting Rights Act that had compelled Southern states to get approval from the US Justice Department before they could make any changes to their voting laws. This Shelby County case led to an avalanche of new voter suppression laws and tactics, which we saw materialize in grotesque form in Georgia in 2018, as the film depicts. Since then, Florida essentially passed a poll tax saying former felons have to pay all their court costs before they can vote. This after that historic referendum in 2018 that allowed the reenfranchisement of 1.4 million former felons, which passed by a huge margin, more than 60% in favor. But then the Republicans in the legislature said they've got to pay all their court costs and fees. And disgracefully, just last Friday, a federal appellate court upheld that piece of legislation that undid the referendum, giving them their right to vote back, with 5 of the 6 judges being appointed by, guess who? Donald Trump. So since 2010, voter suppression laws have been introduced not only across the Deep South, but all across the country in a ton of states, including the state of Wisconsin. Scott Walker and the GOP legislature passed their so-called voter ID law back in 2011, as I'm sure most of you will remember. When it passed, Republican senators, state senators, were described by Republican Senator Dale Schultz's chief of staff as being giddy. That was the adjective the chief of staff used. And he said they were giddy. Why? Because they were making it harder for minorities and young people to vote. Pardon me. The voter ID law requires people to show a government issued ID with your photo on it when you go to the voting booth. It also prohibited you from vouching for your neighbor or your daughter or your son who's going to vote for the first time. It limited early voting, which a federal judge in Madison, Judge Peterson, struck down as being blatantly discriminatory against Black people in Milwaukee because they needed to have more voting places open earlier in the biggest city in the state if people were going to be able to actually take advantage of the opportunity to vote early. And then in the controversial lame duck session, Speaker Voss and Majority Leader Fitzgerald in 2018 tried again to limit early voting, and the same judge, Judge Peterson, struck it down again for the same reason, that it was racist. But then just a couple months ago, the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals down in Chicago overturned much of Judge Peterson's ruling and limited early in-person voting in Wisconsin to the last 2 weeks of the election. That 3-judge panel said that the voter ID law wasn't discriminating against Black people because they were Black, but because they were Democrats, and that's okay. The problem with the voter ID is that many young people, people of color, and elderly people don't have driver's licenses, the most common form of permissible IDs. And going to the DMV to get an ID isn't as easy as it may seem if you're disabled or poor or work 2 jobs or don't have a vehicle. And finding a DMV that's open can be tricky. For instance, if you lived in Sauk City in 2018, the DMV was open only on the 5th Wednesday of every month, and there were only 4 months that had a 5th Wednesday that year. The voter ID law has had its desired effect. Both Representative Glenn Grothman and the unlamented Brad Schimmel, the former Attorney General of Wisconsin, said in public that this law helped or was going to help Republicans win elections in Wisconsin. In fact, it may have been a big reason that Trump carried Wisconsin, as the film said, because thousands of voters may have been turned away at the polls or discouraged from voting by the voter ID law. That wasn't the end of voter suppression in Wisconsin, though. This past April, we saw Robin Voss and Scott Fitzgerald and the biased conservative majority on the Wisconsin Supreme Court refuse to postpone the primary and instead force people into an impossible choice. Either surrender your fundamental right to vote or go vote and risk your life. That should never happen again. What a disgrace that was. Even the US Supreme Court got into the act by ruling just the night before the election that voters would not have the extra week to hand in their absentee ballots, which they'd been promised by a lower court judge here in Wisconsin. Then there was the effort to purge 220,000 Wisconsin voters from the voting rolls, as we saw happen in Georgia. The busy little right-wing law firm down in Milwaukee, the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, urged the Wisconsin Supreme Court to order the Wisconsin Elections Commission to do this to anyone who received a postcard from the commission but didn't return it, even though the postcard didn't tell them they'd be dropped from the rolls. Fortunately, the state Supreme Court deadlocked on this one, 3-3, with a surprising vote and a strong opinion from the otherwise conservative Brian Hagedorn, who sided, quite surprisingly, with the liberals on that one. And so the voting purging isn't going on. They're going to rehear that case, by the way. They're not going to rehear it till after the election, it seems. But now, the right-wingers on the Wisconsin Supreme Court, including Hagedorn this time, are gumming up the works on the sending out of absentee ballots, as you probably heard. On Friday, clerks across the state were preparing to send more than 1 million absentee ballots out tomorrow, Monday, and some had already sent a few out. But now the court's put everything on hold as it considers a lawsuit from the Green Party about getting on the ballot. If it allows the Green Party to get on the ballot, those ballots are all that have been printed already, all million and some, are going to have to be thrown into the garbage, and new ballots are going to have to be reprinted. And for those who got ballots already and filled them out and voted and mailed them back already, there's going to be a real mess. What do you do with that? And when my wife heard this move by the Wisconsin Supreme Court, she said, that's voter suppression. And she's right. That's exactly what it is. It's another example of voter suppression. And so too are the antics of our president, I have to add. His constant demonizing of mail-in voting, foisting upon us the bogus bogeyman of voter fraud, despite a total lack of credible evidence, which I guess has never stopped him before, is nothing but an attempt to sow confusion and chaos so that some people will just throw up their hands and say, okay, I'm just not going to vote this time around. That's what they want to happen. That's the Paul Weyrich strategy, just updated 40 years later. And if that wasn't bad enough, he and Postmaster General DeJoy have been trying to sabotage mail-in voting. You've heard about this too, I'm sure. First, Trump bragged about not giving the Postal Service enough money because, as he put it so bluntly, if they don't have the money to do universal mail-in voting, they can't do it, right? That's a quote from the president. Then the Postmaster General started cutting overtime, reducing staff, and even taking out those high-speed sorting machines at the post office, which he insists are not going to be put back. Not a coincidence, by the way, that he's a huge Trump donor. He gave Trump more than $700,000 over the last 2 years for Trump's reelection campaign. DeJoy, by the way, here in Wisconsin, gave Walker $10,000. Finally, now Trump is even encouraging people to vote twice, which is illegal, which is in fact voter fraud. But let's be clear on the big picture here. Voter suppression is undemocratic, small d, un-American, capital A. Every citizen has the right to vote. That right shouldn't be impeded. As one wise person said in the film, voting should be made easier in a democracy, not harder. You know, the art of politics should consist of two things: getting your own people out and convincing a fraction of those who don't already agree with you that your view of what is good and right and moral and just and American is the best way to go. It shouldn't be about getting fewer people to vote. It shouldn't be about forcing voters who disagree with you to run an obstacle course on the way to the voting booth. But that's how it's been over the last few years here in America. And these sleazy contemporary tactics echo a shameful and a racist past. Excuse me. Now I want to suggest a few ways we can make voting easier in Wisconsin. First of all, we can get rid of the voter ID law. We should be able to vote without a government issue ID. We should be able to vouch for someone who is voting for the first time. I know I used to take my daughter to the voting booth at Blessed Sacrament on the near west side in Madison since she was a little girl. And then when she turned 18, she was a big Obama supporter. We walked into the church, and I could vouch for her and just say, you know, this is my daughter. and everyone knew she was my daughter. The people had seen her, every, time we'd vote, and we voted every 2 years. And yet you can't under the voter ID law vouch for someone like your own daughter, who everybody at the table, all the poll workers know as your daughter, and say, this is Catherine, she's 18, she can vote now. They changed the law. They don't let you do that. That should be changed back. And we should be able, of course, to be able to vote earlier than 2 weeks before election day and in-person voting, early voting. It's not going to happen with this legislature as currently constituted, of course. They're the ones who gave us the voter ID law, and now Robin Voss wants a veto-proof majority. And if he gets that, we won't get that until the legislature is differently constituted, but it needs to happen. Number two, we need to make getting a voter ID easier at the DMV. Fortunately, this is happening already. I'm happy to report it's happening already because Governor Evers, who's in charge of the executive branch, told the Department of Transportation and the DMV under him to get on the ball on this one, and they have gotten on the ball. Some DMVs are expanding their hours of availability to include weekends and evenings, and some are actually relocating their offices or opening new offices closer to public transportation. I know in Madison, before they opened a new one, and I don't know exactly where that is. I think it's on Park Street, but I'm not sure. I mean, it's been really inconvenient for people to get to the DMVs. Number three, we should do what a lot of other states are doing, and that's enact automatic voter registration. Governor Evers included a provision in his budget to bring about automatic voter registration. I think at least 15 states already have this. Oregon was the first one. Once you get your driver's license at the DMV, or once you interact with any other state agency, including state universities and technical colleges, you're automatically on the voting rolls if you're a US citizen. We need to fight for this in the next few sessions of the legislature. And finally, I'm strongly in favor of felon re-enfranchisement. Actually, I'm in favor of letting felons vote even from behind bars. Did you know that there are 2 states right now in the United States where people who are behind bars in prison can already vote? Those 2 states are Vermont and Maine. We should get to that point here in Wisconsin too. That's not going to happen right away, but I think we should push for it. And there are some legislators pushing for it. Realistically, a first step would be to restore voting rights to anyone who's no longer behind bars. Nevada and Colorado did that in the last couple of years. Felon disenfranchisement is a real problem here in Wisconsin. We got 44,000 Wisconsinites who are out of prison. They are formally incarcerated, but they can't vote even though they've been released, because in Wisconsin, you've got to be totally off paper, as they say, before you can vote. That means off of probation and supervision. Now, the restriction that they have to be off paper to vote is a punishing one, and many states don't have it. It isn't logically connected to any crime that they might have committed, and they're being deprived of their fundamental citizenship right, even though they did their time, they're back in the community. That restriction needs to be lifted. Fortunately, there are great groups like Wisdom and Expo that are championing this crucial reform in Wisconsin to combat voter suppression. But these are fights to really throw ourselves in after November 3rd. Because right now, with less than 2 months before Election Day, we got to do all we can to help people vote. That means sharing information on what people need to register to vote and what kind of voter ID card they need. There are 2 great websites that has all this information and more. One is the website of the Wisconsin Elections Commission at myvote.wi.gov. That's myvote.wi.gov. And the other is the League of Women Voters. I love the League of Women Voters. The League of Women Voters of Wisconsin is doing a tremendous job, as are other groups. Their website is my.lwv.org/Wisconsin. Of course, you can just Google League of Women Voters of Wisconsin. We also need to encourage people to apply for those absentee ballots and mail them in as soon as they get them. People need to sign their absentee ballots, and they need to have a witness sign them too. Otherwise, they're not valid. So make sure that you and anyone you might be helping to vote jumps through those hoops. And if all else, and then, if you are worried about the Postal Service, you should drop those absentee ballots off at the clerk's office. I think if you get them in the mail early, more than a week before the election day, you'll be all right. But if you're freaking out about what's going on in the post office, take them directly to the clerk's office or ask if there's a drop box. Some of these clerks in your local communities are having special drop boxes for absentee ballots. So you can put them in the drop box too. And if all else fails, make sure you vote on November 3rd, but do it safely. You know, I'd wear 2 masks, for instance. I was talking with a professor at the University of Wisconsin who was so fed up with the voter suppression tactics underway and with the scare tax on postal service and mail-in voting. He said he and his wife, they're just going to go to the polls. You know, I think it's dangerous with the epidemic flaring, especially right now in Madison. If things settle down a little bit and it's not so dangerous, you know, that's a way to go too. I mean, I don't need to tell anyone here on this Zoom how important this election is. I think it is, well, don't get me going on Donald Trump. Let me just put it that way. That's a talk for another day. But it is a really important election, no matter who you're for. And I think people should vote no matter which way they lean. The good news for getting the vote out here in Wisconsin is there are a lot of inspiring people and great organizations trying to combat voter suppression and boost turnout in Wisconsin right at the moment. Rabbi Bonnie and I, for instance, are on a weekly noon Zoom call with activists from a whole bunch of progressive nonprofits working this problem. And it's, the ACLU is there, a group called All Voting is Local, America Votes, the Brennan Center, the Center for Modern and Secure Elections, Common Cause of Wisconsin, Conservation Voters of Wisconsin, of course, the Legal Women Voters, Wisconsin Voices, and many others, including me at the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign. We strategize together. We try to solve problems together. We contact city clerks all over the state to see how many poll workers they need and what other things they may have trouble with and want assistance with, and where in each city people can drop off those absentee ballots. So we educate people through our memberships and through social media and any channel that we have. And I encourage you to try to educate as many voters as you can. My feeling right now is I'm just a nudger. I just nudge people a little bit who I'm in contact with, who I know maybe aren't happy with their choices or don't vote all the time, but just nudge them about how important the election is and tell them, you know, how easy it is to vote actually once you go to those websites and jump through those couple of hoops. It's really important to demystify the voting process and get to as many people as possible so that they can get to the ballot and cast their ballot. You know, Wisconsin used to have the second highest voter turnout rate in the country, second only to Minnesota's, but lately we've been slipping, and this really isn't the time to slip. This isn't even the time to be number 2. We should push hard to be number 1 in voter turnout in the country. As Fighting Bob LaFollette said 100 years ago, the cure for the ills of democracy is more democracy. We really need more democracy in the United States right now. We really need more democracy in Wisconsin right now. We need more democracy in a hurry. So let's try to help everybody exercise their most basic rights of being a citizen in a democracy and get people out to vote this election time. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Matt, so much. This has been incredibly helpful. And we're already starting to get some questions in the chat. So if you have questions for Matt, please put them in the chat if you are with us on Zoom. If you are with us on Facebook, please write your questions in the comment section. And Morgan, the wonderful intern from Tikkun Ha'ir, will be monitoring the Facebook comments and letting us know if questions are coming in through Facebook. So Matt, I want to start with, there's already been a couple of questions in the Zoom chat. So there's a question, is there any movement to establish a fund to pay back court costs for Florida ex-felons so they can vote? Is that feasible given the number of people and the dollars involved?
Well, it's feasible. I don't know about timing, how soon they need to get those things cleared so that they can vote, but I know there are people talking about doing this. I understand that LeBron James is working on this problem. And here's a little anecdote I know third hand. because I used to work for Ralph Nader before I went to the Progressive, and a friend of mine who worked with Ralph Nader at the time is in regular contact with Ralph. And so Nader called up my friend and said, listen to this idea I got. I just talked to Mike Bloomberg and told Bloomberg, you want to spend $300 million or $1 billion to try to get Biden elected. Why don't you spend a couple $100 million to pay all those fees and penalties for all those ex-felons down in Florida and get that done. So I don't know if Bloomberg's going to be doing that or not, but I know there is some attention being paid to this problem.
Thank you. That's good to know. Why are voting rights advocates always in the position of reacting instead of enacting laws to ensure voting rights in a way that can't be undone by unethical, I'm going to say legislators, because we're a 501c3 and we're not going to be talking about any specific party right now?
Well, I don't think it's true, Susan, who asked the question, because I think a lot of voting rights activists are proposing some of the things that I mentioned: automatic voter registration, felon reenfranchisement, letting felons vote from behind bars, for instance, mail-in voting. Those are some of the things that voting rights advocates are pushing. And there has been legislation introduced on those things over the last couple sessions. It hasn't been going anywhere because the power is arrayed differently. But I don't think it's a fair criticism to say that voting rights activists are only being reactive.
Okay, thank you. Paul Borofsky put a link in the chat if people want to hear more about what's happening currently with the Green Party challenge to being on the ballot. And he also asks, what are issues and strategies for all the problems students will have in registering and in voting?
Well, there are problems for students even before the pandemic. I mean, students need both to have a government issued ID, and some of the university IDs don't qualify as government issued IDs. And secondly, they need to have, check this out, I couldn't believe this. They need to have something that says that their tuition, if they're using a university ID that is valid, they need another ID that says their tuition is paid, and another document that says their tuition is paid. So that if they don't have both of those, and that's an extra hurdle, then they can't vote. Common Cause has a lawsuit pending about that second hurdle, the tuition hurdle, that makes it so much harder. There are a lot of groups working with students across the state to get students registered. I know it's more difficult right now, especially as some are in lockdown.
Right, thank you. We've got questions coming fast and furious. So I'm going to pause for a second from the Zoom questions and ask Morgan if you can unmute yourself and let us know if there are any questions on Facebook yet.
No questions at this time.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so there's a question about the DMVs in Madison, and Matt, as you mentioned, there is a new DMV satellite location in Madison. It is indeed on Park Street. It's on South Park Street. I can't exactly remember, it's either sharing space with the Urban League or it's right next to the Urban League on South Park Street, right off of the Beltline. But the broader question, Madison's DMVs are only on the east and west side, and now there's this south side location. The west side want over an hour bus ride plus a 5-minute walk, which many people cannot do. Is there anything that can be done about urging the DMVs to have satellite sites or anything else?
Yeah, I mean, Evers was instructing the DOT to do this when he took office, and he had legislation on it too that didn't go anywhere in the budget. They stripped it out, but he does have executive power over the DOT, so he has been leaning on them. We had to elbow him a little bit in the Wisconsin Voting Rights Coalition that Bonnie and I are involved in, and the other groups are involved in. We sent a letter to him saying, let's get the DOT off the stick on this one. And so I know there is some action within the DMV and Department of Transportation to do this.
Can you explain how the Federal Election Commission ended up without a quorum and how can that be resolved?
Well, the Federal Elections Commission has been pretty much a useless government agency here for a while. And right now they don't even have a quorum, but they used to be split with equal members on the Democratic side and equal members on the Republican side, kind of like our Wisconsin Ethics Commission, Wisconsin Elections Commission. And just could not get anything done because the partisans on either side would nullify what the other side wanted to do. Right now, there have been resignations, so that they can't even get to a quorum to conduct any official business. It's outrageous, really.
Yeah, thank you. Somebody asked if we're going to share information about opportunities for getting involved, and yes, when we've answered all the Q&A, we are going to talk about all the different organizations that are doing this work and how you can get involved, and a few upcoming events that you can participate in as well. Oh, and somebody very helpfully, thank you very much, Kathleen, wrote in the chat that the DMV location is at 1810 Park Street, and the hours are on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Unfortunately, they are only during business hours, and we are trying to persuade them to have either an evening or a Saturday time as well. But thank you for that information. Do we know, oh, this is a great question. Do we know when the Wisconsin Supreme Court will rule on the Green Party and when the delayed absentee vote mailings will be able to go forward?
Well, they need to rule soon because if they don't rule soon, it will be impossible to send out ballots to members of our armed services who are overseas. And there is a federal law that requires those ballots to be sent out, 6 or 7 weeks ahead of election time. And we're getting right up against that deadline. So I'm hoping that the conservatives on the Wisconsin Supreme Court are aware of that and also aware of the problem that all the local clerks have who've already gotten their absentee ballots all ready to be sent out. I imagine, I'm guessing that there will be a ruling sometime this week coming up, but you never know. You never know. I think it's a very corrupt and partisan court, unfortunately, that has gone way downhill in its reputation over the last 20 years, especially after the great Chief Justice Shirley Abramson was unceremoniously and stripped of her office. So, they've been playing partisan games up there for way too long.
Right, thank you. So somebody says, I received a postcard this past week from the United States Postal Service that provided erroneous guidance. That is, that ballots should be sent 1 week ahead, which we all know well that may not be enough time. What's being done to educate people about how early ballots need to be mailed?
Well, yes, these postcards have come out, and it's not just to Wisconsin, it's around the country. I think in Colorado, there's a lawsuit pending against the post office for providing bogus information. But we're doing a lot of work. All the groups involved in this Wisconsin Voter Rights Coalitions, I named off a bunch of them, not all of them, but a lot of groups are working to educate people about how early to get their ballots, absentee ballots in. And, the short advice is the earlier the better.
Yes, exactly. Is it true that drop boxes for absentee early ballots will be in Madison City Parks?
I don't know the answer to that. Do you, Bonnie?
Yeah, so interesting question. So September 26th and October 3rd, there will be an opportunity to register to get and fill out and return your absentee ballot in, I think they're in over 100 city parks. It may even be all the city parks all around town. If you go to Madison City Clerk's office webpage there, and Daniel, if you could find that in the chat and drop it in the chat for me, please. You will be able to find the list of all the parks that will have somebody there. It will be from I believe it's from 9 until 3. Again, it's Saturday the 26th and Saturday, October 3rd. They both also have rain dates of the following day. And if you live on my side of town and you come to Elver Park between 9 and 12, I'll be there. Come say hi. I'm a poll worker. Also both the Wisconsin Election Commission and the State League of Women Voters are keeping a running list of where all the early voting locations and all the drop boxes are in all the locations around the state. So please keep an eye on those websites as well, so you'll be able to find where you can drop off your absentee ballot or where you can go to vote early. And as Matt said, unfortunately, recent court ruling said that early voting cannot start earlier than 14 days before the election. So October 20th is when early voting will start in most locations around the state. Sammy, thank you. Sammy Avner put in the link to where the drop boxes are in Milwaukee. And as somebody noted, this information is not well advertised, and that is true. So we all need to be diligent about reaching out to our family and friends and congregations and book groups and knitting groups and everybody that you know, and the person you jog with and the person sitting next to you on the bus, socially distanced, that this information is out there and is available and that everybody needs to share it. So the question was asked about the Supreme Court, our Supreme Court, if they do decide to allow the Green Party to be on the ballot, are the ballots going to need to be reprinted? And can the ruling be appealed to the United States Supreme Court because of the federal deadline?
It would need to be reprinted. And yeah, any decision can be appealed to the US Supreme Court, but everything's going to happen quickly because of this September 19th deadline to get ballots out to overseas members of the armed services.
Exactly. So Daniel put in the link for the city of Madison for where the drop-off sites will be for the ballots. And Susan quite rightly notes that not everybody lives in Madison, and people who are in the smaller towns and rural areas have fewer options.
Well, first, I think the advice to do is contact the clerk, the town clerk, and either get an absentee ballot from the town clerk or do early voting in those 2 weeks prior to the election day at the town clerk's office. And the earlier, again, the better. You're less likely to have a crowd of people and have a health concern if there's only 2 or 3 people in there. If you're going, 9 days before election day, I don't think that's likely to be a crowded day, but who knows? In Madison, it might be a crowded day.
Yeah, exactly. If you do not know where your municipal clerk is, or you don't know how to find them, if you go to myvote.wi.gov, you can find who your municipal clerk is, and especially people who live outside of the bigger cities, but even those of us in the larger cities, it's really important to contact your city clerk, find out where their drop box is, where the early voting location is going to be, and if they have enough poll workers. It's also a really important question to ask, and encourage anybody who is not in a high risk category, if they feel at all comfortable signing up to be a poll worker. It's an incredibly important thing to do anytime. It's even more important now because of the pandemic. It traditionally, older people, retirees tend to be poll workers. In the pandemic, they are at high risk and don't want to come out. So there is a dearth of poll workers around the state. So if you are able at all to be a poll worker, that's also an incredibly important thing to do. So find out who your municipal clerk is, be in touch with them, and ask them some of these important questions and help them to get the word out. Morgan, do we have questions on Facebook? Okay. Well, when Morgan is able to unmute herself. Oh, there you are. Hi. Morgan, do we have questions?
Nope, no questions.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yep.
So Sammy notes also that Tikkun Ha'ir will be compiling a list of drop-off locations for the Milwaukee North Shore suburbs. And Sammy, if you want to drop Tikkun Ha'ir's website into the chat, that would be really great. Has anything been done to assure that the physically incapacitated have the opportunity to vote?
Yes, and I would encourage people to contact Disability Rights Wisconsin. Disability Rights Wisconsin has done an incredible amount of work about accessibility for those who have disabilities, and they would be able to tell you what's specifically being done.
Thank you. Sammy, this might be a question for you to answer in the chat. How can we get involved with the Urban League and Common Cause's efforts to reach Milwaukee voters? And Sammy, if you want to unmute yourself and answer, as well as putting things in the chat, you can feel free to do that too.
Thanks, Bonnie. I would reach out directly to those organizations. At this moment in time, Tikkun Ha'ir isn't specifically connected to either of those. We're connected to a bunch of other things, but I would reach out directly to Urban League or Common Cause.
Great, thank you.
Let me just mention a couple other groups in the Milwaukee area. Wisconsin Voices is doing a lot. Souls to the Polls is doing a lot. Those would be two places. Voces de la Frontera is doing some work. A lot of people, a lot of groups doing good work in Milwaukee.
Yes, thank you. And Reverend Greg Lewis, who's the president of Souls to the Polls, is on with us. So Reverend Lewis, if you want to drop Souls to the Polls contact information or website in the chat, I'd like to invite you to do that. Somebody notes, and I'm not sure if this is statewide or just in Madison, 16-year-olds can work the polls and they can get trained to do so. Matt, do you know anything about that?
I don't, I'm sorry.
Okay. I know that there is a move to encourage high school students to get trained and to be poll workers. You don't have to work the whole day. You can take shifts, so you can take a shift that's after school. Anybody who wants to be a poll worker should know that you can choose to work the polls as a volunteer, but you can also choose to get paid. And because of COVID, there's a special pandemic rate, as it were. So I think that it's $21 an hour now. Using Madison's minimum wage of $13.21 or whatever it is, plus another $8 and something that they're adding on to it because of the pandemic and because of the shortage of poll workers, so that they can encourage people to become a poll worker if at all possible. Marnie asks, will libraries be early voting sites even if they're not open?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know how they're dealing with that, because typically in Madison, we've got a great clerk in Madison, and she's done everything possible with the libraries and the Parks Division to give people as many opportunities to vote as possible in the libraries. But I don't know with COVID right now what the situation is. Do you, Bonnie?
I know in Madison, many of the libraries, not all of the libraries, but I know Sequoia and I think the Penny branch, a few other branches. This is on the League of Women Voters website and this Madison City Clerk's website. They actually are listing a few libraries, not all of them, but a few of them as early voting sites. And my understanding is that they're all outside. So it's all curbside voting. So you're not going into the library, but you can go to the library and somebody will be there to help people vote. But check again with wherever location you're in, please check with your city clerk or go to the League of Women Voters website and look for early voting and absentee ballot and drop box locations. They're keeping that updated as much as they can when they find out the information. This is a very important question, and this has been a problem in the April and August elections. Some folks have problems with finding a witness for their absentee ballot. This may be particularly difficult for those who are physically incapacitated. Any suggestions?
Yes, on our Zoom call on Wednesday, this came up too, and I know Disability Rights Wisconsin is trying to help with people. I think Common Cause and the League of Women Voters, your local chapter will try to get someone over there to help you get a witness signature. If there isn't a League of Women Voters chapter there, you could call or contact the state chapter and they'll try to get someone out there to help you. And you shouldn't seal your absentee ballot before the person, before the witness signs it, because the witness is supposed to be there while you are filling out the absentee ballot. So it's just something to be mindful of.
Thank you. Okay, so there are a few comments and a couple more questions. So somebody very helpfully, thank you, Madeline, put the link to apply to be a poll worker in Madison. Sammy did put her contact information and the website for Tikkun Ha'ir. Sorry, I didn't introduce her properly. Sammy Steinovner is the executive director of Tikkun Ha'ir in Milwaukee. Tikkun Ha'ir is Hebrew for repairing the city. And they're doing amazing work in Milwaukee, not just with voting, but with all kinds of things. Somebody noted the recent court decision in Florida stipulated that the state was not required to inform former felons of the amount of their fine. So far, none of the 85,000 former felons who have requested their fine information have received it.
I didn't know that. It doesn't surprise me. It's outrageous. And I'm hoping they'll get some assistance, legal and also just with doing the legwork with the clerks in the counties where they were incarcerated or with the Justice Department of Florida and try to figure this out. But my understanding is some of those, not only the formerly incarcerated people, but the DAs that put them away don't even know, how much they owe. So it's kind of a nightmare. I mean, that court decision was a nightmare.
Yeah, that sounds terrible. Somebody has a great suggestion. How about advising everyone? And so now I am advising you all. Contact 3 people or acquaintances to make a voting plan and to get 3 of their friends to do the same.
I'm all in favor of this. I think, those of us who are interested in getting more and more people to vote should work on people we know already. The idea of doing robocalls or just getting a list of people to call all over Wisconsin. I'm not going to say it's useless, but it's not as useful as using your personal relationships with people you have a relationship that's you built up over time, like Bonnie was saying, those people in your book club or you exercise with or you do whatever with. Those are or people in your family. Those are the people you're going to likely have actual influence with, as opposed to people you're doing knocking on doors or cold calling. So I do think it's important for everyone who's concerned about turnout to grab, be responsible for 2 or 3 people, 5 people, 10 people that are in your relationship orbit and try to persuade them to come out and vote if they have any hesitation and help them if they need the help.
Great, thank you. And the Wisconsin Interfaith Voter Engagement Campaign is doing this. It's called Relational Organizing, and we're doing it through an app called Empower that you can put on your phone, and it encourages you to list up to 10 of your family, friends, acquaintances, people you're regularly in contact with. And then we send out calls to action every week or so that remind you, hey, talk to your contacts about remembering to fill out their absentee ballots. Talk to your contacts about, October 20th starts early voting. So we will send out messages to help you, to remind you of things that you want to be talking about. And as Matt said, it's not cold calling people you don't know with a script. It's talking to people you are already in contact with. There's no script. There's just an ask. And you can just mention it as, in regular conversation. It doesn't have to be a special thing. But it's so important. People listen to people that they already know and like and trust. So please use your connections to spread the message.
And I'd also,
yeah, go ahead.
Bonnie, I'd also use your, I mean, if you're active on Facebook, you know, I would do that too. That's more scattershot unless you're just doing messaging people individually, which I'd be in favor of doing too. I'm going to be doing that. You know, I've got a group of people, not all of whom, you know, I'm on the same page with, but I'm going to be contacting as many people scattershot on Facebook and then direct messaging on Facebook, just to use your personal leverage that you have to get people to vote.
Thank you. Somebody messaged me privately that the Milwaukee libraries will be drop-off sites 24/7. And Sammy notes that Tikkun Ha'ir is also doing relational organizing in the Milwaukee area. We have a question from Facebook. It's a good question. How could ballots be reprinted on the special paper and distributed by the September deadline to mail them to the military?
I have no idea technically, mechanically, how that's going to get done. That's why it's such a crazy intervention by the state Supreme Court. And they're going to have to wrestle with this tomorrow or the next day, or they're going to get lawsuits from members of the armed services. And so, you know, they've got to get off the dime here.
Yeah. We have a couple of comments and questions about being a poll worker. Betsy Abramson reminds us that one of the requirements to be a poll worker is that you do have to be an eligible voter yourself. So you do have to be 18. So you can be a high school student as long as you're 18. And then somebody asks, can you be a poll worker if you don't live in the district?
Don't know.
So my understanding is that in order to be a poll worker, the requirements are you have to be a U.S. citizen, you have to be an eligible voter, you cannot currently be a candidate in an election for which you would be a poll worker, and you have to live in the county in which you would be a poll worker. So you don't have to be a poll worker at your own polling site. You can be at any other polling site as long as it's in the county where you are a registered voter. So if you're in Milwaukee County, you can't go be a poll worker in Ozaukee County, but you can be a poll worker anywhere within Milwaukee County, as long as that's where you're registered. Somebody also put in the chat the voter helpline. So here in Dane County, we have the Voter ID Coalition, which is co-led by the Dane County NAACP and the Dane County League of Women Voters. They have a voter helpline. The phone number is in the chat, and you can call them and ask for help getting a witness, and also ask other kinds of logistical questions about voting. What else? Sorry, I'm just sort of scrolling through here. This is true. Somebody who is under 18, if you're 16 or older, you can be a poll worker, but there's only specific jobs that you can do. So you can't actually be registering or logging people in to vote, but you can be a greeter and do other kinds of things. So there's some things that you can do as a poll worker. You can't do all of the jobs if you're under 18, but there are a few jobs that you can do.
I see that Steve Kozlov has a question about are drop boxes preferable because of the questions about the Postal Service, and I think they are preferable to that. If you're at all concerned about the post office gumming things up, try to get it into one of these drop boxes that your community has. Assuming your community has one, that's why you got to call your local clerk. It is easy to contact the local clerk. Just Google your town or city's name and clerk's office. I did that for our Voting Rights Coalition. I just Googled Fond du Lac and Wausau County clerks and called them up out of the blue and asked them some questions, and they answered the questions.
Right, thank you. So I just want to take a couple more questions because at the end somebody did ask if we're going to have some concrete information about how to get involved, and we are going to do that. And yes, the conversation is being recorded. It'll be on Wisconsin Faith Voices Facebook page forever because nothing ever leaves Facebook. And we're also going to be putting up on our YouTube channel. People are putting all kinds of great information in the chat, and we will capture all of this information and send it out to everybody along with the slides that we're going to show in a minute with a lot of URLs for how to get involved. So somebody notes it's extremely important to read all the instructions regarding absentee ballots before you begin to fill them out, in addition to making sure that the witness sees the blank absentee ballot first. Then after the voter fills in his or her ballot, which the witness not only does not have to see, but shouldn't see because everybody's allowed to vote privately, the witness has to sign the absentee ballot envelope with all the other required info, and that required info includes their address. And there was an unconscionable number of absentee ballots that were thrown out in April and in August, either because the voter forgot to sign it, the witness forgot to sign it, or the witness forgot to put their address on it. And the number of absentee ballots that were thrown out basically equaled the number of ballots by which Donald Trump won Wisconsin in 2016. So every vote counts, every ballot counts. Please fill it out correctly. Daniel is putting into the chat the links to the Empower app for relational voting. So if you're interested in signing up for that, there are some that are regionally specific, and there's some that, and there's one link that's a general. If you're not in Green Bay, Kenosha, Madison, or Milwaukee, you can sign up just for the general link. That's all I see. So I'll give you all just another minute or two. Morgan, anything else in the, can your spouse be a witness?
Yes.
Yes, indeed. Your spouse can be a witness. Also, Matt, do you have to hand in your absentee ballot in person, or can you give it to somebody else to hand in for you?
There was some discussion about this at the Wisconsin Elections Commission. That's why I'm hesitating. The safest thing to do is to hand it in yourself, but there are circumstances where you can have somebody else hand it in for you.
Yeah, so I mean, at least in Madison, as a poll worker, anybody could drop off anybody's absentee ballot. We never asked anybody if it was their ballot. So, you know, we know that low-income people, people of color, Native Americans, disabled Americans are often the most disenfranchised. How can we help these communities to be able to vote?
Well, I would work with organizations that are addressing the needs of those communities. So that would be Black Leadership Bloc, African American Roundtable. It would be Conservation Voters of Wisconsin has a native vote group organizing effort. Voces de la Frontera does some tremendous work all across the board. Souls to the Polls. These are groups that are working within communities to educate, motivate, engage, and get voters out. So I think that's the best. Just hook up with the organizations that are working within the communities is the best way to go. Wisconsin Voices is another good place to go.
Thank you. If we're to sign our ballot exactly as the signature on file, and we do not remember if we included our middle name or initial, how do we determine if our signature has the name or initial on file?
Well, you could contact your clerk, but I imagine the address on the outside of the absentee ballot, I would imagine that would match, but I would check with I check with your clerk first, because you don't want to be thrown out on a technicality. And in the film, a lot of people were thrown out on a technicality, as you'll see if you haven't watched the whole film, because their name had a hyphen on the voter rolls, and you put it in without a hyphen or vice versa, and so they were thrown out.
Right. As somebody noted, Wisconsin actually doesn't use signature matching. That's what the witnesses are for.
Good.
And I've heard from a couple of the city clerks around the state that they make every good faith effort to match the signature with the name on the poll books, and they're not, they're not that strict. I
The
mean,
other thing,
don't
yeah.
sign with your nickname or anything. Sign with your real name, but don't worry about if you forgot your middle name and they have your middle name or something like that.
And some clerks will allow you to cure a defect in your absentee ballot if they get it in time. And they will try to contact you and say, look, you didn't sign your ballot or you didn't have a witness signature. I wouldn't rely on that. Make sure you try to fill it out properly, but it is possible if you screw up that they'll get back to you.
Yes, thank you. So this is an interesting question. There's no restriction on handing in a particular person's ballot, but there may be issues with ballot harvesting by groups. Matt, can you say a little bit about ballot harvesting, what that's all about?
Yeah, I hadn't really heard that term until about 6 months ago. Ballot harvesting is where one group or another tries to collect as many absentee ballots as possible and then hands them in. This became notorious in North Carolina, where there was someone going around grabbing people's absentee ballots and throwing them into the garbage. And so there is a question, whether the activist groups are going to be collecting everybody's absentee ballots and hustling them in, and somehow that's going to be a bad thing. And so there was a big discussion at Wisconsin Elections Commission about so-called ballot harvesting. But generally, I think this is a lot of noise without a lot of substance behind it.
Thank you. Older adults in assisted living facilities and nursing homes. Betsy Abramson, who works on elderly advocacy, reminds us, check with your county Aging and Disability Resource Center to see what they're doing to help these folks who are in, as Betsy says, super lockdown.
I think, and I can be corrected again, but I do think that someone with the clerk's office goes to these facilities and people can vote at their facilities, but I'm not sure again. But that's what I heard. You know that, Bonnie?
So I was part of a safety and voting committee through Dane County Public Health. And one of the things we were talking about was how to help people in assisted living and nursing home and senior living facilities, because as Betsy said, they are in super lockdown. Most of them are not allowing outside visitors. And it used to be that voter registration ambassadors would come in to these housing units and facilities and help register people and help them get their absentee ballots and all those things. And that's not happening now. And so part of the suggestions was asking some of these facilities if they would designate a staff person who could get trained, and the training is available online, and then that person can help the residents get registered, get their absentee ballots and vote. Another suggestion was to ask the facilities to have a laptop available in the common space and have a voter registration ambassador on Zoom. And so it would be announced to the residents, I don't know, Saturday morning between 10 and 12, come down to the common room and there'll be somebody on Zoom who can help you fill out your ballot. And I know that was a suggestion that was made. I don't know if anybody's following through on it. If you have family and friends who are in an assisted living facility or a senior adult facility and they're not receiving visitors, get on Zoom with them and help walk them through how to do this. You can share your screen with them and show them how to do it online. And if anybody needs help with that technology, email me and let me know, and I'll show you how to do it, and then you can show them how to do it.
And I'd also encourage folks to contact the facility itself and urge that facility to have one of their staffers help the residents with that.
Yeah. Are you notified if your ballot is thrown out?
I don't believe so, but I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think you are. I know that you can track if you've requested your ballot, if your ballot request has been processed, and if your ballot has been sent, you can track all that on myvote.wi.gov, but I don't think you are told if your ballot's thrown out. If anybody knows and wants to throw that in the chat, that would be great.
You can check at myvote.wi.gov, but it may not be until after the election.
Yeah.
So says Kathleen. Thanks, Kathleen.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm just trying to scroll through here. My scrolling isn't scrolling. You can check on myvote.wi.gov several weeks after the election if your ballot was counted. Let's hope we know that.
Cynthia has given us the timeout signal here.
Oh, okay. Oh, yes. Okay. So thank you, Cynthia. I know people still have other questions. Please feel free to keep putting them in the chat because we do save the chat and we can either answer you privately later on or if there are a lot of people who have similar questions, we can send it out to everybody who's registered. If you are on Facebook and did not get your question answered, please email me, rabbibonnie@charter.net. Morgan, if you can throw that into the Facebook, or Daniel, if you can throw that into the Facebook comments. And we will be sending out information, follow-up information after today. Matt, thank you so incredibly much. This has been just wonderful. People are already writing in the chat how helpful this has been. And we really appreciate your taking the time to be with us and to share all this information with us today. It's really been tremendous.
It's my pleasure, Bonnie. My email too, people can contact me at Rothschild. There's a silent S between the Roth and the child. Rothschild@wisdc.org. And yeah, I'm doing radio tomorrow morning, 7:30 on Wisconsin Public Radio on gerrymandering. So if that's an issue you're interested in, you can tune in there. Thanks so much, everybody.
Fabulous. I'm going to turn it over to Cynthia Hirsch to share some information about how people can get involved.
Can you hear me? Am I unmuted? And Daniel, are you going to put up those slides?
Yes, sorry, it'll just take me a second.
Sure. I also want to thank Matt. That was really terrific. I learned a lot. I especially appreciated the historical perspective. So are the slides up? I can't see them.
Yes, they are.
Okay, for some reason I can't see them. So, but you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay, so Daniel, we'll just have to sort of do this by osmosis. The first slide, which I assume is up, is listing some of the organizations that Matt talked about. These organizations are doing great work, and I suggest that you review this slide and the next one, number 3. And if there's an organization that resonates with you, that you think you sort of share their mission, please contact them. They're all working hard to make our election a fair election. And those would be slides 2 and 3. And again, you're going to get copies of all of these slides emailed to you. Slide 4 are resources for voting information. I think Matt really answered a lot of our questions about that, but here are the websites for the Election Commission as well as the League of Women Voters. And you can contact them if you have any questions at all about voting. Slide 5. Here are some recommended books and films. I especially recommend The New Jim Crow. It was excellent. But I think all these books and films are really worth watching and paying attention to. I think we're all feeling pretty revved up about the election, and these will help give us some facts to help us advocate. And then finally, the next slide, ready to take action. Is that one up? Is it up?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
This is the contact information for Rabbi Bonnie and Dr. Bakken. Again, I want to thank them so much for putting this together. They've done a terrific job. And by the way, when I saw this slide on the PowerPoint, I emailed Rabbi Bonnie and said, you know, you're going to get 150 emails. And she said, I would be thrilled to get 150 emails. So do not hesitate to contact her with questions or requests for information, all 159 of you. And finally, the last slide, slide 7, are some upcoming events that are being sponsored by some of our sponsors, the Interfaith Center at Miami of Ohio and the Tikkun Ha'ir Milwaukee Jewish Community Center, and our own voter engagement campaign is having some regional meetings throughout September and October. Besides thanking Matt and Bonnie and Peter, I really want to thank Daniel and Sammy and Morgan, because they are the people behind the scenes making this technology work. And to me, that is the most challenging part of it. So thank you all very much for being there on Facebook, online, and making the technology work. And I think, is that it, Bonnie? Are we done?
Yes, and Cynthia, thank you so much for volunteering to facilitate today's event. It was really, really helpful.
So I want to thank all 159 of you for participating. And I want to remind you that the film ends with a statement that I think is very true. And that is, if our votes didn't matter, they wouldn't be trying to stop it. So let's get to work, and let's all, in the words of Matt Rothschild, let's all get out there and be nudges. Thanks, everybody.